In the grand cosmic joke that is interspecies education, there exists a universal constant. Someone will always be wrong on the hologram. And when that someone happens to be a six-tentacled professor with 16 academic degrees and an ego the size of a small gas giant, well, that's when things get interesting. The Galactic Confederation's premier academy of military sciences wasn't just any educational institution. No, this was the place where the brightest minds from across 17,000 star systems came to learn the intricate art of not getting their respective species obliterated, situated on the artificial ring world of Nexus Prime, because apparently regular planets weren't pretentious enough. The Academy occupied a sprawling campus of impossible architecture and even more impossible bureaucracy. The admission standards were, to put it mildly, ridiculous. Most applicants had better odds of spontaneously developing telepathy than receiving an acceptance notice. The Academy's selection committee, composed primarily of long-lived species who considered a century to be just a quick nap, had refined the art of saying no to a degree that would make even the most hardened customer service representative weep with admiration. And yet, here we are, witnessing the galaxy's most exclusive institution of higher learning struggling with the concept of downhill advantage in battlefield tactics. One might think that beings capable of faster-than-light travel would grasp such elementary concepts, but one would be entertainingly wrong. The Academy's halls were a testament to the Confederation's commitment to overwhelming architectural excess. Ceilings soared hundreds of meters high, accommodating species of all sizes. Gravity plates shifted seamlessly to accommodate visitors from worlds ranging from 0.2 to 3.4 standard Gs. The air was a carefully calibrated mixture, suitable for oxygen, methane, and various other breathers, filtered through personal atmospheric fields that gave everyone a faint, shimmery outline, like walking through life with a permanent beauty filter. Most impressive, though, was the Academy's central database, which contained military records dating back nearly 20,000 standard years. Every significant battle, skirmish, and diplomatic misunderstanding was logged, analyzed, and taught as either a shining example of strategic brilliance or a cautionary tale of monumental stupidity. The database's AI was rumored to have developed a sense of humor after cataloging so many instances of the latter. Into this grand institution, the Confederation had recently, and somewhat reluctantly, admitted representatives from a newly discovered world classified as, cue dramatic music, a death world. The designation wasn't meant to be complimentary. It referred to planets with such absurdly hostile conditions that most civilized beings would consider them suitable only for emergency landings or particularly vindictive exile. The planet in question? Earth. A Class 12 death world with shocking biodiversity, extreme climate variations, and native apex predators that had evolved to become the dominant species despite having absolutely no natural business doing so. The fact that humans had managed to avoid extinction long enough to develop spaceflight was considered by many xenobiologists to be either a statistical anomaly or proof that the universe had a particularly dark sense of humor. The Confederation's diplomats, ever eager to avoid adding another potentially troublesome species to their potential threats list, had extended the olive branch of educational exchange. This is how a human girl from the high-gravity, high-oxygen, bacteria-ridden nightmare world called Earth found herself sitting in advanced military history, surrounded by beings who considered her homeworld only slightly less terrifying than a supernova. The human exchange student sat near the back of the amphitheater-style classroom, trying not to draw attention to herself. This was challenging, considering she was the only one in the room with only 2 arms, no visible exoskeleton, and skin that wasn't some variation of bioluminescent or chromatophoric. In a galaxy where most evolved species had shed their predatory traits millennia ago, she was a walking museum of evolutionary aggression. Forward-facing eyes, canine teeth, and a skeleton made of calcium that continuously repaired itself like some organic horror show. But perhaps most unsettling to her classmates was how unassuming she appeared. Based on briefings about Deathworlders, they had expected something covered in spikes and dripping venom. Instead, they got someone who looked about as threatening as a Class 3 herbivore, yet could, according to the mandatory medical scans, survive radiation levels that would cook most of the class from the inside out. The human didn't fit neatly into the Confederation's carefully categorized view of the universe, which was precisely what made her presence so disruptive. She was the gravitational anomaly in their perfectly modeled system. The data point that refused to align with predictions. She had quickly learned that there were two types of reactions to her presence: fascinated curiosity or barely concealed unease. Her classmates, who specialized in xenobiology or comparative evolution, found her absolutely fascinating, a walking, talking case study in Deathworld adaptation. Military strategists, on the other hand, looked at her the way one might regard an unexploded bomb, with professional interest tinged with healthy caution. The Confederation had been studying humans since first contact 3 standard years ago. They had translated Earth's military history, analyzed human physiology, and even attempted to understand the bizarre human concept of recreational danger. Yet, for all their research, they still hadn't quite grasped the full implications of a species that evolved on a world where nearly everything was trying to kill them from day one. What the Confederation's extensive studies failed to convey was the sheer stubbornness that came with being from a world where rainstorms could fry you with lightning, where microscopic organisms waged constant war against your immune system, and where other species regularly evolved specifically to hunt you. Human history wasn't just a record of conflicts. It was a testament to terminal obstinacy in the face of a planet that seemed designed for their extinction. So when Professor Xyvex floated into the classroom on his gravitational buffer, a needlessly flashy alternative to walking, the human merely observed, with the quiet assessment of a species that had spent millions of years determining whether things were going to eat them. Professor Xyvex was the leading authority on comparative military tactics in the mid-rim sectors, a fact he managed to work into approximately 72% of his sentences. A Ventari by species, he resembled something like a cross between an octopus and a crystal chandelier. All translucent tentacles and bioluminescent communication nodes that flashed in complex patterns when he was particularly excited about hearing himself speak. The professor wore the traditional academic robes of the Ventali scholarly caste, which meant approximately 14 layers of increasingly pretentious shimmering fabrics, each denoting a different field of study he had mastered. The overall effect was like watching a sentient disco ball with opinions about ancient warfare. "Today," the professor announced, his voice resonator adjusted to a frequency that perfectly captured academic condescension, "we shall analyze one of the more interesting conflicts from the newly indexed Human Military Archive. Consider this an anthropological curiosity, a glimpse into how warfare evolved on an isolated death world." Several students activated their recording modules. A few sent surreptitious glances toward the human, who appeared to be doing that unnerving human thing where they sit completely still except for blinking. The Musk student 2 rows ahead actually changed colors slightly, their chromatophores shifting to a pale blue that, in their species, indicated scholarly interest mixed with mild indigestion. "The conflict in question," continued Xyvex, his tentacles making dismissive gestures that set his academic medallions tinkling, "occurred during what the humans call their 20th century, a particularly violent period, even by Deathworld standards. With a flourish that sent ripples through his elaborate robes, the professor activated the classroom's holographic display. A topographical map materialized in the center of the room, showing terrain that would make most civilized species reconsider their vacation plans. Jagged mountains, dense forests, and winding rivers that cut through valleys like scars. Behold the region humans designated as Eastern Europe, specifically the Carpathian mountain range. This conflict, which humans called their Second World War, saw opposing forces engage in what they considered sophisticated tactics, though by Confederation standards the technological level was roughly equivalent to our primitive pre-unification era. The holograph zoomed in, showing troop positions marked in red and blue. The professor gestured with a tentacle, and miniature representations of human military vehicles, primitive combustion engine tanks and artillery pieces, appeared on the map. Note the positioning of the defending forces, shown here in blue. They have attempted to establish what they called a defensive line along this river valley. The attacking forces, in red, are advancing from the north and east. According to human military documents, this was considered a strategically significant engagement, due to its proximity to resource centers. As Xyvex continued his explanation, something curious happened. The human student's expression shifted subtly. To most of her alien classmates, the change would have been imperceptible, human facial micro-expressions being beyond the perceptual range of most species. But a careful observer might have noticed her slight frown, the narrowing of her eyes, and the almost imperceptible tilt of her head, all primitive Deathworld signals indicating that something was not quite right. The attacking forces, the professor continued, oblivious to the humans' reaction, deployed their mechanized units along this axis, attempting to outflank the defenders by traversing this valley. His tentacle traced a path through the holographic terrain. A futile effort, as you can clearly see. The defenders held the superior position and repelled the attack with minimal casualties. The professor's bioluminescent nodes flashed in a pattern that translated roughly to self-satisfied academic smugness as he turned to face the class. This engagement exemplifies the primitive nature of human tactical thinking during this era. Note the inefficient use of terrain, the predictable approach vectors, and the reliance on brute force rather than strategic finesse. One might argue that such tactics reflect their evolutionary background as persistence predators, all stamina and no subtlety. Several students dutifully noted this observation in their personal databanks. A few even nodded their sensory appendages in agreement, eager to demonstrate their understanding of the professor's wisdom. The human student, meanwhile, appeared to be experiencing that uniquely human emotion that xenopsychologists had struggled to translate into galactic standard. "Are you freaking kidding me right now?" She sat there, internal conflict playing out behind eyes that had evolved specifically to track movement across open savanna. The battle the professor was describing was wrong. Not just slightly inaccurate, but fundamentally, hilariously wrong. Like someone claiming water flows uphill, or that black holes make excellent vacation destinations. Her human educational background included extensive military history, standard curriculum on a world where conflict had been a constant companion to civilization. She recognized the battle being described, but the professor's holographic representation had several critical errors. The topography was accurate enough, but the troop positions, movement vectors, and outcome were about as historically accurate as claiming that humans reproduced through binary fission and subsisted on a diet of pure mathematics. The question now was whether to correct him. The Academy had a strict protocol for classroom participation, particularly for guest species. Interrupting a professor of Xyvex's standing would be considered somewhere between a minor diplomatic incident and an open declaration of species-wide rudeness. On the other hand, sitting through an entire lecture of tactical nonsense that would make her military ancestors spin in their graves fast enough to power a small city, that was its own special kind of torture. She weighed her options carefully, considering the potential fallout. Best case scenario, brief embarrassment followed by academic correction. Worst case, reinforcing every stereotype about humans being confrontational apex predators with no respect for established authority. The diplomatic briefing specifically mentioned avoiding behavior that could be interpreted as challenging dominance hierarchies. Apparently, a serious concern when your species has eyes at the front of your head and the ability to run for hours without stopping. But there was another factor at play, one uniquely human and completely baffling to most Confederation species: the almost pathological inability to let someone be wrong when you know the right answer. 6 seconds. That's how long her internal debate lasted. 6 seconds of weighing diplomatic consequences against historical accuracy. 6 seconds before she did, possibly the most human thing possible, she raised her hand. The gesture itself caused a minor stir. Unlike many species present, humans signaled their desire to speak by elevating a limb, a motion that, to species with more violent evolutionary backgrounds, looked distressingly similar to the prelude to an attack. A Firian student 3 seats away actually activated their defensive membrane in response. Professor Xyvex's lecture halted mid-sentence, his bioluminescent patterns shifting to a frequency indicating surprise, tinged with annoyance. All 14 of his optical sensors swiveled to focus on the human student. "Yes, the representative from Earth has a question?" His voice resonator barely concealed his irritation at being interrupted during what he clearly considered a masterful analysis of primitive warfare. The human stood, a motion that reminded everyone present that Deathworlders were unsettlingly good at changing elevation quickly. "Not a question, Professor. A correction." The amphitheater went silent. Even the atmospheric circulation systems seemed to pause in shock. Correcting a Ventari academic was roughly equivalent to telling a Dravian hive queen that her larvae looked a bit pudgy. Technically possible, but rarely attempted by those with a functional self-preservation instinct. The professor's tentacles stiffened slightly. Correction? How fascinating. The exchange student believes she can correct the Confederation's leading expert on comparative military history. His bioluminescent notes flickered in what the universal translator somewhat inadequately rendered as condescending amusement. "Please, enlighten us," he continued, making a sweeping gesture with his tentacles that set his academic medallions jingling. "What aspects of my analysis of your species' primitive conflict do you wish to correct?" The human, displaying that peculiar Deathworlder trait of becoming calmer rather than more agitated when challenged, stepped forward. "The battle you're describing is the Carpathian Mountain Offensive of 1944, specifically the engagement at Dukla Pass. But your troop positions are completely reversed, the timeline is compressed, and your conclusion about the outcome is incorrect without waiting for permission." Another alarming human trait. She approached the holographic display. The professor's tentacles coiled in surprise as she reached into the projection and began manipulating the interface, as if she'd been using Confederation technology all her life. "May I?" she asked, though she was already rearranging the holographic elements. It wasn't really a question so much as a courtesy notification that things were already happening. With quick, precise movements that reminded several students that humans possessed frightening levels of fine motor control, she rearranged the position of the troop markers. Red units shifted from north to south. Blue defenders moved from the valley to the highlands. The attacking forces were actually approaching from the south, not the north, she explained, her voice calm and matter-of-fact. And they weren't repelled. They broke through the defensive line after 3 days of fighting. The defenders had established positions here, here, and here. Her fingers traced patterns through the hologram, leaving blue markers in their wake. The attacking force split into 3 columns to navigate these mountain passes. The class watched in stunned silence as she completely reconstructed the battle simulation in under a minute. The precision of her movements was unsettling to species that required extensive cybernetic augmentation to achieve similar levels of coordination. "The key to understanding this battle," she continued, seemingly oblivious to the effect she was having on the classroom, "isn't just the troop positions but the terrain and weather conditions. The defenders held the high ground initially, which would normally be advantageous, but unseasonable rain had turned these slopes into mud. Their heavy artillery became bogged down, literally. Meanwhile, the attacking force used the dense forest coverage here to mark their approach with forward reconnaissance units." She tapped a section of the hologram and the topographical display shifted to highlight the features she was describing. The professor's tentacles had gone completely still, a Ventari expression of either intense focus or existential crisis. "The battle's outcome hinged on these 3 mountain passes," she continued, highlighting narrow corridors through the terrain. The defenders' command assumed they were impassable due to weather conditions and didn't allocate sufficient forces to monitor them. The attacking force, however, had forces specifically trained for mountain warfare. Soldiers from regions with similar terrain who understood how to use these conditions to their advantage. With a few more adjustments, she set the simulation in motion. The holographic units began moving according to her corrected parameters. The class watched as the attacking force executed a flawless flanking maneuver through supposedly impassable terrain, encircling the defenders and forcing a retreat. The battle ended with the attacking force securing the pass after 72 hours of fighting. The defenders suffered approximately 60% casualties before withdrawing to secondary positions 15 kilometers to the northwest. It was considered a textbook example of how specialized environmental training can overcome conventional tactical advantages. She stepped back from the hologram, which now displayed a completely different outcome than the professor's original presentation. The simulation concluded with the red forces in control of the contested territory, the blue defenders in retreat. Exactly opposite to what Professor Xyvex had described, the silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a Mibari stealth feather hit the floor. 23 different species of sentient beings stared at the human with expressions ranging from amazement to alarm, all wondering the same thing. How does she know this? The professor's bioluminescent nodes had shifted to a deep purple, a color that the universal translator didn't even attempt to interpret. When he finally spoke, his voice resonator had dropped to a lower frequency. "You seem remarkably well informed about this particular conflict," he said, each word carefully measured. "Perhaps you would care to explain the source of your expertise." The question carried unspoken implications. Information about human military history had been provided to the Confederation through official diplomatic channels. An individual human with detailed knowledge of historical battles raised interesting questions about Earth's educational practices. The human shrugged. A disconcertingly fluid motion that reminded everyone her skeleton was internal. "It's standard curriculum in our education system. This particular battle is studied because it demonstrates the importance of specialized training and environmental adaptation. Also, my great-grandfather fought in it." That last casual comment sent a ripple through the classroom. The concept that a current student could have a direct familial connection to a historical conflict was alien to most species present. Many came from long-lived races where generational memory was measured in millennia, not decades. The idea that humans lived so briefly that they could have direct ancestral connections to what the Confederation considered historical events was somehow both pitiable and terrifying. "I see," said the professor, though it was clear he didn't, not really. "And you are certain of these details because primary sources," she replied simply. "Letters, military records, personal accounts. My great-grandfather's unit was part of the flanking force that came through the Northern Pass. His field journal described how they moved at night, used local guides who knew mountain hunting trails, and carried their supplies on their backs when the terrain became too difficult for vehicles." She gestured to a particularly rugged section of the holographic terrain. "This ridgeline here. His unit climbed it in darkness, in the rain, carrying full combat loads. The defending forces thought it was impossible to bring troops through there in those conditions. They were wrong." Professor Xyvex's academic medallions clinked softly as he processed this information. For a being with 16 distinguished degrees and author credits on over 40 scholarly works on military history, being corrected by an undergraduate exchange student was unprecedented. That the correction came from a representative of a species that had achieved faster-than-light travel barely a decade ago made it even more difficult to process. "You are suggesting," he said finally, "that your educational system includes detailed tactical analysis of historical conflicts as standard curriculum?" The human nodded. "Military history is part of our core historical education. This particular battle isn't even considered especially significant in the broader context of the war. It's just one of dozens we study from that period." A Trilaxian student near the front of the class raised a sensory appendage. Query: Is military education universal on Earth or restricted to specialized castes? The human blinked. Another unsettling reminder that she lacked protective, nictitating membranes. "It's part of standard historical education. Everyone learns it." This revelation caused another wave of unease to sweep through the classroom. The implications were concerning. A species where military knowledge was distributed throughout the general population rather than contained within specialized warrior castes represented a fundamentally different approach to societal organization than most Confederation cultures practiced. "Fascinating," said Professor Xyvex, in a tone that suggested he found it anything but. "It appears our cultural exchange program continues to yield unexpected insights. Thank you for your contribution." He made a visible effort to regain control of his classroom. However, while these historical details are indeed noteworthy, they do not change the fundamental principles of engagement that this example was intended to illustrate. It was a transparent attempt to save face, and everyone knew it, including, from her slightly raised eyebrow, the human. But she merely nodded and returned to her seat, leaving the professor's corrected battle simulation still floating in the center of the room like a holographic monument to academic embarrassment. The rest of the lecture proceeded with Professor Xyvex noticeably less confident in his analysis of human military history. He kept glancing toward the human student whenever he made assertions about Earth conflicts, as if expecting another correction. It never came. She merely observed with that unnervingly intense forward-facing gaze that evolution had crafted specifically to track prey animals across vast distances. As the class concluded, the professor made an announcement that surprised everyone present. In light of today's educational exchange, I believe it would benefit us all to reconsider some of our assumptions regarding developing species. Our next session will feature a collaborative analysis of advanced military doctrine across multiple cultures, including contributions from our exchange students. It was as close to an acknowledgement of error as a Ventari academic was capable of making. Practically a full apology by Confederation standards. As the students filed out of the classroom, the human found herself surrounded by classmates with questions. Most kept a respectful distance. Evolutionary instinct died hard, but their curiosity overcame caution. "Is it accurate that all humans receive tactical education?" asked a Ferian student, their translator struggling to convey the concept in terms their crystalline neural network could process. "How many historical conflicts do humans typically study?" inquired a Mersksul, their chromatophores cycling through colors indicating academic excitement. The human answered patiently, explaining concepts that seemed perfectly ordinary to her but represented radical departures from Confederation educational norms. No, they didn't have specialized military castes. Yes, historical conflicts were taught alongside art, science, and literature. No, they didn't consider this unusual. How else would you learn from past mistakes? Watching from the doorway, Professor Xyvex's bioluminescent patterns shifted through frequencies indicating deep thought. The incident had forced him to reconsider not just his lecture notes, but his entire understanding of Deathworld species. The Confederation had always viewed such worlds as evolutionary dead ends. Crucibles that produced hardy but ultimately limited life forms too focused on survival to develop sophisticated culture. Yet here was evidence that suggested something else entirely. That constant struggle might forge not just physical resilience but intellectual adaptability. That a species evolved under relentless pressure might develop not just the capacity to survive, but to analyze, remember, and improve upon their strategies, generation after generation. Most concerning of all was the realization that humans didn't just study warfare academically, they internalized it, passed it down through direct familial connections, treated it as living knowledge rather than historical curiosity. For a species that had only recently joined the galactic community, they carried their history not as distant academic record, but as immediate cultural memory. As he watched the human student calmly explaining how her species had progressed from stone tools to nuclear weapons in what Confederation historians would consider a historical eye blink, Professor Xyvex found himself wondering what other assumptions about Deathworld species might prove equally mistaken. The implications went far beyond one embarrassing classroom correction. If the Confederation had so fundamentally misunderstood human educational practices, what else had they missed? What other aspects of Deathworld psychology had they failed to properly assess? Professor Xyvex made a mental note to revise his next academic paper. Its working title, Primitive Conflict: Evolutionary Disadvantages of Deathworld Military Development, suddenly seemed not just inaccurate, but potentially dangerous in its complacency. Perhaps, he reflected as he watched the human gesturing to explain some concept of flanking maneuvers to her fascinated classmates, the Confederation's assessment of humanity's potential place in the galactic order required significant recalibration. The standard xenopsychological model suggested that species evolved on Deathworlds would be aggressive but straightforward, dangerous in direct conflict but predictable in strategy. Yet here was evidence that humans combined their physical resilience with an unexpected capacity for analysis, adaptation, and tactical sophistication, a species that could produce individuals who casually reconstructed historical battles from memory, who considered detailed military knowledge to be basic education, and who maintained living connections to conflicts that the Confederation would consign to distant archives. Such a species might navigate the complex waters of galactic politics with far more skill than previously anticipated. As the group finally dispersed, the human student gathered her materials and headed toward her next class. unaware of the profound effect her 6-second decision to raise her hand would have on Confederation policies regarding Earth. She was simply doing what came naturally to any human student, correcting an instructor who got their facts wrong. And perhaps that, Professor Xyvex reflected as he floated back to his office to completely rewrite his lecture series, was the most unsettling realization of all. What the Confederation viewed as an unprecedented diplomatic incident, the human considered just another Tuesday in class. The universe, it seemed, had a particularly dark sense of humor after all.